Somewhere in the north of Scotland, carved into standing stones that have weathered 15 centuries of wind and rain, there are symbols that no living person can read. A crescent crossed by a broken arrow, a double disc, a creature that resembles no animal that has ever existed, which scholars simply call the Pictish beast. More than 200 of these carved stones survive across Scotland, covered in a symbol system that appears to have been used consistently for centuries, which means it was meaningful, structured, and understood by the people who made it. It was writing, or something very close to it, and yet no one today can read a single symbol with certainty. The people who made them, the Romans called the Picti, the painted ones, a reference to the tattoos or body paint that Roman writers described. They controlled most of northern Scotland for the better part of 600 years, fought the Roman Empire to a standstill, built a sophisticated society with kings and craftsmen and Christian monasteries, and then, according to the conventional story, vanished from history so completely that for centuries they were considered one of the great lost peoples of Europe, a civilization that left behind unreadable messages and then disappeared before anyone could learn to read them. More than 25 million Americans claim Scottish or Scots-Irish ancestry. It is one of the largest heritage groups in the United States, woven through Appalachia, the American South, and the founding mythology of the frontier. The Scots-Irish, descendants of lowland Scots, who settled in Northern Ireland before crossing the Atlantic, populated the backcountry of colonial America and pushed westward into the mountains, carrying a culture and a stubbornness that became central to the American self-image. Behind that identity lies Scotland, and behind Scotland lies a deeper question that most people who fly the family tartan have never considered. Before there were Scots, there were Picts, and the relationship between the two has been one of the most persistent puzzles in British history. And underneath that heritage, at its deepest layer, sits a question that the ancient DNA has only recently been able to answer. Who were the Picts? What happened to them? And are the people who claim Scottish descent today actually connected to the painted people who carved those unreadable symbols into stone? The answer is stranger and more complete than the legend of a vanished people ever suggested. The Picts enter recorded history through Roman eyes, and the Romans did not like what they saw. When Rome conquered southern Britain in the 1st century AD, they pushed northward into what is now Scotland and met a resistance they could not overcome. The tribes of the north fought the legions to a standstill. Rome built walls, Hadrian's Wall, and briefly the Antonine Wall further north, not to expand, but to contain. The Picts were, in a real sense, one of the few peoples in Western Europe that the Roman Empire failed to conquer. They raided Roman Britain, they allied against it, and they outlasted it. The Roman historian who first recorded the name Picti was writing in 297 AD, describing enemies who harried the northern frontier of Roman Britain with a persistence the empire never managed to suppress. In 367 AD, the Picts joined with other peoples in what Roman sources called the Great Conspiracy, a coordinated assault on Roman Britain that overwhelmed the frontier defenses and threw the province into chaos for months. Rome restored order, but the lesson was clear. The north could be walled off. It could not be conquered. When Rome withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the Picts were still there, still independent, still painted. One of the very few peoples on the fringes of the empire who could genuinely claim they had never been beaten. For the next several centuries, the Picts dominated northern Scotland. They built an extensive network of settlements, developed the elaborate symbol carving tradition that still baffles scholars, converted to Christianity, and formed kingdoms that competed for control of the region. And then, in the 9th century, the historical record of the Picts goes quiet. By around 900 AD, the kingdom of the Picts had become the Kingdom of Alba, the precursor to medieval Scotland, and the Pictish language, the Pictish symbols, and the Pictish identity disappear from the record. The painted people were simply gone, replaced in the sources by the Gaelic-speaking Scots. For centuries, this disappearance was treated as one of history's genuine mysteries. Some suggested the Picts had been exterminated, wiped out in a Gaelic conquest. Others proposed they had been a fundamentally different people, pre-Celtic, perhaps even pre-Indo-European, a relic population that had survived in the far north until the Gaels finally overwhelmed them. The strangeness of their symbols and the apparent absence of their language fueled theories that the Picts were something exotic and separate, an alien presence in the British Isles that vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The 8th century historian Bede recorded a tradition that the Picts originated in Scythia, the distant steppe lands far to the east, and had arrived in Britain by sea. Medieval and later writers seized on the idea of the Picts as outsiders, fundamentally different from the other inhabitants of Britain. The unreadable symbols seem to confirm it. A people who wrote in a script no one could decipher, spoke a language that left almost no trace, and then vanished. Surely such a people must have come from somewhere truly foreign. The ancient DNA has now dismantled almost every part of that mystery. In 2023, researchers published the first ancient genomes recovered from individuals buried in confirmed Pictish cemeteries dating from the 5th to the 7th centuries AD. The samples came from sites in eastern and northern Scotland, the heartland of Pictish territory, including a cemetery at London Links in Fife. Recovering ancient DNA from these remains was technically difficult because Scotland's acidic soils are hostile to genetic preservation, and the number of confirmed Pictish burials available for study was small. But the researchers succeeded in recovering usable genomes, and the results were, in a sense, anticlimactic, which is exactly what made them important. For a people who had been built up over centuries into one of the great mysteries of European prehistory, the genetic answer was almost startlingly ordinary. The Picts were not a pre-Celtic relic population. They were not exotic newcomers from some distant region. They were not genetically distinct from the other peoples of Iron Age Britain. The Pictish genomes showed that they descended from the local Iron Age population of Britain, the same broad genetic stock as the other Celtic-speaking peoples of the island, derived ultimately from the Bronze Age Bell Beaker population that had transformed Britain 2,500 years earlier. The Picts were not aliens, they were Britons. The painted people were a local development, not an external intrusion. The unreadable symbols remain unread. The Pictish symbol system, the crescents, the V-rods, the double discs, the mirror and comb pairings, the impossible beast, was clearly meaningful and clearly systematic. But whether it represented a writing system, a heraldic system of names and lineages, or something else entirely, is still unknown. Some researchers believe the symbols recorded personal names, perhaps marking the stones as memorials or statements of territory and descent. The matrilineal social structure that the DNA later confirmed may even be encoded in them. But without a bilingual inscription, a Pictish Rosetta Stone pairing the symbols with a known language, they may never be deciphered. The people are no longer mysterious. Their messages still are. This finding resolved a debate that had run for over 1,000 years. The Picts had always seemed mysterious because their symbols were unreadable and their language was poorly attested, but genetically they were simply the northern branch of the Iron Age British population, developing their own distinctive culture in relative isolation from the Romanized South. The mystery of their origins was a mystery of culture and language, not of biology. The second finding was the one that connected directly to the 25 million Americans claiming Scottish descent. The Picts did not vanish. They were not exterminated. The ancient DNA showed clear genetic continuity between the Pictish population and the later medieval and modern populations of Scotland. When the kingdom of the Picts became the kingdom of Alba, and the Pictish identity gave way to the Gaelic Scottish identity, this was not a population replacement. It was a cultural and linguistic transformation imposed on a population that largely stayed where it was. The Picts did not disappear as people. They disappeared as a label. The transformation has a traditional date and a traditional figure attached to it. In the mid-9th century, a king named Cniad mac Alpin, Kenneth MacAlpin, in its anglicized form, is said to have united the Picts and the Gaelic-speaking Scots of Dalriata into a single kingdom. Later tradition cast him as a Gaelic conqueror who overthrew the Picts, and even invented a story of him massacring the Pictish nobility at a treacherous feast. The genetics show this dramatic conquest narrative is false. There was no population replacement. The Gaelic language and Gaelic culture spread across northern Britain through political dominance, intermarriage, the influence of the Gaelic-speaking Christian church, and the gradual prestige of Gaelic kingship. And the people who had once called themselves Picts began speaking Gaelic, adopting Gaelic customs, and identifying as Scots. It was assimilation, not annihilation. The Pictish elite were not slaughtered. They were absorbed, and within a few generations their grandchildren were Scots, who may not have remembered that their ancestors had ever been anything else. Their descendants are the Scottish people. Their genes are still there. This is the same pattern that ancient DNA has revealed across Europe again and again. The dramatic events of recorded history, the disappearance of a people, the rise of a new kingdom, the replacement of one identity with another, frequently turn out at the genetic level to be transformations rather than replacements. The Picts were not destroyed. They were rebranded by history. The continuity of the population through the apparent catastrophe of cultural disappearance is one of the clearest examples in the genetic record of how political history and demographic history can tell completely different stories about the same event. The third finding concerned the structure of Pictish society itself, and it confirmed something that medieval sources had hinted at but never proven. Early historical accounts of the Picts suggested they may have practiced matrilineal, tracing descent and royal succession through the female line rather than the male. This claim had been treated with skepticism for centuries, dismissed as a misunderstanding by outside observers who did not understand Pictish customs. but the ancient DNA from Pictish cemeteries revealed patterns consistent with the historical hints. Individuals buried in the same cemetery frequently showed no close paternal line relationships, while displaying connections through the female line. This pattern is consistent with a society in which women remained in their home communities and men moved between them, the opposite of the patrilocal pattern common across most of Europe. The Picts appear to have organized their society around female lineages in a way that was genuinely unusual for early medieval Europe, and the genetics supported what the medieval sources had only been able to gesture at. What emerges from the ancient DNA is a portrait of the Picts that is both less mysterious and more interesting than the legend. They were not a lost people from nowhere. They were native Britons who built a distinctive culture in the north, resisted Rome successfully, carved symbols we still cannot read, organized their society in an unusual way, and then gradually transformed into the medieval Scots without ever disappearing as a population. The mystery was never who they were. It was how completely a people could change their language, their name, and their identity, while remaining genetically exactly who they had always been. The 25 million Americans who claim Scottish ancestry are connected through that unbroken genetic line to the painted people who fought the Roman legions to a standstill and carved their unreadable symbols into standing stones that still stand in the north of Scotland today. The Picts never vanished. They just stopped being called the Picts. If you want more history that DNA is rewriting, subscribe to The Lost Blueprint. New discoveries every day.